Hello, everyone, and welcome to this public talk and conversation with Professors Thi Phu and Yideng Troeung. My name is Elena Wang, and I'm a graduate student at the Social Justice Institute at UBC, and I have the pleasure of introducing the talk today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from UBC Vancouver, which is situated on the unceded ancestral and traditional territory of the Musqueam Nation. I also want to acknowledge that land acknowledgements themselves are insufficient, and to emphasize the importance of actively foregrounding decolonization, not just in asides and acknowledgements, but through our thinking, actions, scholarship, activism, politics, creative works, and more. Our talk today is the third of the Social Justice Institute 2021 to 2022 Noted Scholar Series. This year, our theme is Entangled Knowledges, Practices of Dreaming, Reflecting, Relating, and Being Present, which aims to explore questions related to social justice and epistemic justice. It is my great honor to introduce Professors Thi Phu and Yideng Troeung, whose talk and conversation today is entitled Refugee Archives and the Transpacific, Activating Anecdotes and Family Photography. To make good use of the time available, I'm only going to give a short introduction, but I've shared the full speaker bios on screen that do better justice to the significance and richness of their work and contributions. Yideng Troeung is an assistant professor of English at the University of British Columbia, researching and teaching in the fields of transnational Asian literatures, critical refugee studies, global South studies, and critical disability studies. She is the author of the book, Refugee Life Worlds, The Afterlife of the Cold War in Cambodia, which is forthcoming fall 2022. And Thi Phu is a professor of media studies at the Department of Arts, Culture, and Media at UTSC, and the director of the Family Camera Network, a collaborative research project that engages local communities in the building of an anti-racist public archives through family photos and stories. She's also the author of and co-editor of 5 books that you'll see listed on screen. So Thi Phu and Yideng, welcome. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Yideng.
Thank you so much, Elena. And hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming today. It's really wonderful to see the names of so many people that I know. I know that this time right now is very busy and difficult and frankly, heartbreaking times for so many of us. So I really appreciate you all making the time to join myself and my dear friend and colleague Thi Phu for this 1-hour conversation today. For anyone who, I would also like to thank Pilar Riano Alcala for the invitation to speak today, and to everyone else on the organizing team for making this Noted Scholar Series possible. For anyone who might be joining this meeting with access to audio only, I will just provide an accessibility description of my screen view. I am an Asian woman with medium length black hair and side bangs. I'm wearing a plaid red shirt today, and I'm standing in my office at UBC with many, many books in the background. It's a beautiful sunny day here in Vancouver. And I'm standing on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Today, I'll be talking about the topic of refugee archives of the Cambodian diaspora, a community that, like the indigenous nations here on Turtle Island, continues to reel from the unresolved legacies of imperial war, genocide, and the continuous surfacing of mass graves that hold the unidentified remains of our loved ones, families, and ancestors. Our histories and futures continue to intersect in the afterlife and in the wake, as do our collective wills towards regeneration and renaissance towards the horizon of liberation for all. So the format that T and I have decided on for today is that each of us will speak for about 12 minutes, followed by a discussion between the two of us. And then at 12:45 approximately, we will just open it up to the audience for comments or questions and engagement. So to give you just a little bit of context about what I'm just about to read, the following fragments are excerpts from my forthcoming book. And it is a book that intersperses textual analysis, theory, and history with family anecdotes. So I share 3 of these with you today. And let me just share my screen here. Anecdote 1, the ground. Throughout my life, I've heard my mother tell and retell the story of my birth many times. In 1979, my mother, father, and 2 young brothers escaped from Cambodia. They made it to a refugee camp called Tme, New Camp, located on the Cambodian side of the Thai-Cambodian border. The genocide was over, but the war raged on between all the different political factions. Every day, a Red Cross bus arrived in the morning to transport a caravan of people across the border. When the bus arrived on one particular morning, my parents were determined to get on it. They sensed an imminent danger and they knew the time had come to pick up and leave yet again. In a crowd of refugees pushing forward, they jostled in front of the bus in hopes of being selected. Knowing the sick and the pregnant were given priority, my mother showed her pregnant belly to the Red Cross workers and managed to secure a spot for our family on the bus. After a 16-hour journey, excuse me, the bus arrived at Khao Dang Holding Center, a sprawling camp inhabited by over 130,000 people. Soon after they got off the bus, my mother and father heard the news about the attack at Tme. The night before, just after my family had boarded the bus, Khmer Rouge soldiers arrived at the camp without warning, burning the camp to the ground. In Khmer, giving birth is referred to as Troeung Tonle, meaning to cross a river. My mother gave birth to me in Khao Dang about 1 month after our arrival there. To remember this passage, my mother and my father chose the name Idang for me, Idang in English, a heavy name to carry. And yet this name, Mom and Dad always remind me, holds the memory of our multiple crossings and our survival. My book, Refugee Life Worlds, is about the afterlife of the Cold War in Cambodia. It scrutinizes this topic from a specific angle. As in the image shown here, taken in the camp where I was born, this angle extends up from the ground of Cambodian refugee history. In the background, the mountains of Khao Dang loom, forming a picturesque backdrop for 6 people: my mother, me, an unknown girl, and 3 other members of my extended family. A story of pain subtends this image, including death, illness, disappearance, starvation, forced marriage, child loss, and so much more. But what is pictured here is not a portrait of suffering. It is an image of serendipitous reencounter and reconstituted ephemeral family, of a mother's fleeting instance of joy born out of a chance encounter with another Cambodian refugee wielding a Polaroid camera. What mother would not want a photo, at least one photo, of her new child in that fragile first year? In places such as Cambodia, where the archive has been shattered and is still in the process of being restored and rebuilt, conventional scholarly methods do not suffice. For refugee scholars such as myself, it is important to honor and respect the knowledge that has been passed down to us by our families and by our community. Some of these stories that we carry are never meant to be heard outside of the community, while others, if curated with care, might begin to genuinely move and circulate in the world with the force of transformation. It is a delicate ground that we must carefully navigate, for we hold the knowledge that just a few decades ago, our families lived through a war and genocide that the world scarcely remembers. Cambodian American author Monica Sok has written about the kind of struggles with language that we grapple with as the children of Cambodian survivors. As a poet, Sok writes, quote, "I'm afraid of misrepresenting my family's stories, the general history as well, though I believe the risk of going there is greater than fear. A big part of me is afraid of perpetuating brutality through language." Channeling Audre Lorde's assertion that, quote, "We can learn to work and speak when we are afraid in the same way we have learned to work and speak when we are tired," Sok affirms in the end the importance of going towards that silence as a means of transforming what terrifies and immobilizes us. But like Sok, I have also struggled with the process of writing, rewriting draft after draft of my book in a cycle of fury, depression, exhaustion, illness, self-doubt, inspiration, depression, and inspiration again. We labor tirelessly in hope and fear of getting it right, only realizing in hindsight that this goal is impossible. We supposedly live with the imprint of epigenetic trauma in our genes. We fear passing it on to our children. We know intimately what it is like to live our lives with a kind of debilitating silence and aphasia, coupled with an ever-present knowledge that carrying our silence for too long will shatter us, or to use Lord's metaphor, choke us from within. But we also know something else, that what we carry cannot be reduced to a defective history, psychology, or genetic profile, that it is possible to speak through silence, to use the pieces of our fragmented past to remake new worlds. Anecdote 2, the sky. On April 17th, 1975, the capital city of Phnom Penh in Cambodia fell to the communist Khmer Rouge regime. I was not yet born, but my mother and father remember this day all too well. A year earlier, the Cambodian Civil War had reached a lull. The US bombs were no longer falling on the Cambodian countryside, and there was an eerie sense of calm. My parents reopened their convenience supply store, which was frequently visited by soldiers and generals of the US-backed Long Nol Army. But then my mother and father began to notice a change in the air once again. The Cambodian currency, the riel, started to devalue and depreciate. Inflation began to spiral out of control. People began hoarding food and medicine, paying more and more for the same item with each passing day. Within a few short days, all the shelves of my mother and father's supply store were completely emptied, as were those of all the jewelry stores and pharmacies in the city. Fearful of what all this could mean, my parents began to make preparations for the family's evacuation. They buried their valuables and money in the ground and waited for further news. People whispered that after years of illegally bombing Cambodia, the Americans were about to withdraw from Southeast Asia. 2 days before April 17th, 1974, a general came to my parents' store to pay off his tab. He urged my parents to leave immediately and assured them that he could get the family out on the next helicopter evacuation if they wanted to go. When my mother remembers this pivotal moment, the choice to stay or to go, her eyes glaze over with tears. She said to me once, "We didn't know, we never imagined what Cambodia would become, that the world would change overnight. We thought the war was over. This is the biggest regret of my life. What we went through after, what your brothers went through, I'll never forgive myself." My mother remembers how at 8 a.m. the next day, the skies above the city were filled with black helicopters, circling like a spiral of birds. She watched as at least 10 of them swooped down and lifted away those who were on the evacuation list. Well, seared into the memories of most survivors who lived through the war firsthand, audiences here in Canada likely remember experiencing the last days of the Vietnam War from a distance, as they watched the scenes of frantic helicopter evacuations on the news. Today, these scenes of wartime upheaval, refugee evacuation, and people left behind are with us once again. In scholarly accounts, it's not uncommon to hear references to the Cambodian precedent or the lessons from the Vietnam War in discussions about the nature of the contemporary conflicts in the Greater Middle East and elsewhere. Indeed, Cambodian people's history of suffering was an ethical lesson not learned by the world. But US leaders who dropped over 2.7 million tons of bombs on a neutral country certainly did learn something from Cambodia about the expendability of human life and the scant consequences of these actions, that wars could be porous, borderless, and waged in secrecy, that civilians could be killed and maimed with complete impunity. But there are also limits to this structure of comparativity. To what extent do past wars become legible and grievable only insofar as they offer lessons for the contemporary moment? And to what degree is it even possible to cite Cambodia as a meaningful lesson for the present when we have yet to look seriously at the example on its own terms? Such logics of naming precedents and unprecedents forecloses an understanding, in Denise Ferreira de Silva's words, of how the assemblage of global capital that produces the global displaced is sustained by the racial figure of the human that allows the demarcation of who falls on either side of the law, namely the protective and the punitive. The refugee lessons of the past reasoning also rely upon liberal positivist assumptions of Enlightenment progress that, as Alexander Wahili calls, a liberal notion of wounding that assumes that suffering must always follow the path of wounded attachments in search of recognition from the liberal state. Some wars that we think are over are merely on hold, in a lull. The afterlife of one war bleeds into and merges with the afterlife of another, forming an entangled web of death, injury, loss, and heartbreaks for victims and perpetrators alike, albeit asymmetrically. So I have one more anecdote about the kapok tree, but I think in the interest of time here, because I'm quite aware of how short our session is today, I think I will just turn it over to T now. And then if there's any questions about the kapok tree during the discussion, I'm happy to take those up.
Okay, thank you so much, Idang. It's really hard to follow you, but I'll try my best to do your presentation justice. Hello, everyone. I'm Tifu, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'm joining you from Toronto, the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River, which is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And Idang began by talking about anecdotes, by telling you anecdotes. And so I'm going to tell you stories about photos and what we can do with them. I've been looking at photographs all my life, not just because this is what I do in my work as a professor of media studies. It's because images are the background of my daily life, and I think about them a lot. I'm excited to share with you my thoughts on their usefulness as archive and method in critical refugee studies and for thinking about the aftermath of war. I begin not with an image, but a story about an image. Photographs have touched me personally. When I was growing up, they adorned my parents' homes. They were kept in albums that we carried with us with every move. As for the taking of pictures, it was a ritual. In one photograph, my brother and I posed next to an artificial Christmas tree in the first apartment we lived in Toronto. Behind it was a television, which as children we were glued to, even though the rabbit ear this tree. Everything you saw in this image, the tree, the presents, the smiling, bright-eyed children with bowl-cut hair, middle-class trappings, or what seemed to be middle-class trappings that belied the sparseness of our actual lives, the shabby sofa with ugly brown plaid just outside the photograph's frame. Though we didn't give much thought to why we so compulsively recorded our lives in Canada, in retrospect, I began to understand its importance in showing that we had come far as refugees from Vietnam, leaving behind so much for the promise of more. Later on, my parents decided to pull out our family snaps from the cheap gummy albums they had been pasted in. My father proceeded to digitize them, scanning them, and then setting up a slideshow, which he then set to music. And I'll just give you a sample. Something that he would have heard. Hopefully you can hear this. This is a soundtrack that he selected from a repertoire familiar to the Vietnamese diasporic community. Familiar to the Vietnamese diasporic community, especially those who left in the first and second waves as so-called boat people. This group likes to evoke music that we call nhạc trước 75, the music before 1975, pre-1975 music, the period before we lost our home and our country. In this way, we listened to images. So they're not simply things that photographs are not simply objects that we look at. These are artifacts that we listen to, that we hold close even when we no longer can see them or have them. They showed us a time before, they marked how far we've gone. I have no personal memories of the war, but the images and the music touched me deeply. They were exquisite, sharp, piercing, painful, but also beautiful. Let me tell you another story about a second image. You can see and sort of not see it. Taken from a before time when we were still in Vietnam, my brother and I pose with our parents in a studio near our grandmother's one-story home. I know this because on the verso, someone, I don't know who, has printed our full names. Do you want to see me? Out here. That's me. I'm the one with the funky bangs. Next to my parents' names on the back of the photograph are their birth dates, as well as my brother's birth dates. However, beside my name and that of my brother, someone has completely scratched out our birth dates using thick black marker. When I asked my parents, who are both in their own way family archivists, for help in deciphering this erasure, they are just as perplexed and can only confirm that this photo was from the before period and had actually been left behind in Vietnam. Years after we had resettled in Canada, our uncles and aunts who still lived in Sadek must have mailed it to our new homes, reuniting us with our old lives. I pressed further. Did the marker erase a truth about our past? My brother and I learned recently that our official birthdays are not when we were actually born, a discrepancy that is, I think, a common phenomenon amongst displaced people. Because my father had forgotten these details, about birth dates and so on, he actually made up our birth dates, relating this information to camp administrators who promptly recorded them as facts on our UNHCR cards. In more ways than one, refugee ID photos marked our rebirth at the camp. As for this family photo behind me, by the time it caught up to us in Canada, an unknown hand, tasked with the solemn responsibility of keeping the family record, had reset the past to align with the present. Blotting out our birth dates enabled us to start again. Images are around us, everywhere, all the more so when it's super easy to snap and share with smartphones automatically, even compulsively. Even if you aren't a photographer and even if you don't appear in photographs yourself or at all, nevertheless, photography is more than just an image. It is an event, some critics say, a ritual that we all participate in as viewers. My good friend Laura, who's as fascinated with photographs as I am, likes to say that we all come attached to images. By this, she means that we all carry with us a powerful emotional linkage to images. They touch us in some way. This can be the case even if, and especially if, the image has been lost or destroyed, if it's not something that you can hold on to, if it's something you had to leave behind, if it's a past you are compelled to reimagine in order to restart. Over time, I realized that these ordinary images, frequently called family photographs, which often form the background of our daily lives, can reveal a lot about who we are, about our hopes, our dreams, and histories if we pause to look and really listen to them. For racialized diasporic people, and especially for refugees, many of whom left abruptly and who were unable to bring anything with them, images link us to our past. They help us give shape and form to the future we wish for. They are a way of documenting the undocumented. And yet, family photos are probably not what come to mind when envisioning refugees. It's a highly conventional and deeply personal genre associated with shy smiles, chagrined grimaces, and surprised joy that greet bourgeois rites of passage, such as birthdays, graduations, weddings, housewarmings, and vacations. Family photos seem far removed from the kinds of experiences typically associated with refugeeness, which are usually emblematic of spectacular suffering. Additionally, critics who approach domestic images, often as a term that's often synonymous with family photos as a so-called home mode of communication, may view them as bound solely to the private sphere. However, as Laura Weissler demonstrates in her landmark study of white women photographers and their role in perpetrating tender violence within the US and in imperial missions, particularly in Asia, domestic images are versatile and ideologically portable precisely because they bridge public and private spheres. Domestic images, in other words, are powerful vehicles for the consolidation of domesticity, and yet critics have not yet fully explored their function in producing and in their production and circulation across the diaspora in response to US imperialism and other forms of imperialism. Family photographs are a resource that enable us to broaden refugee narratives beyond damage, suffering, and trauma to encompass joy and laughter and more. The personal offers a potent source of knowledge for members of marginalized communities, particularly among racialized diasporas whose stories have received little attention in mainstream institutions. Personal images are a disregarded resource for learning about these paths, for sharing our knowledge about ourselves, and for projecting our hopes and dreams. The challenge then is how to look and listen to images and their rich stories so that we might write new histories about ourselves and about refugee communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, T. So I think we're just going to have a brief conversation with each other, and then we would love to engage with everybody gathered here at around the 12:45 mark. So T, one thing that really struck me when you were talking was that you say that family photos are not usually what come to mind when we think of refugees, who are typically portrayed in a very specific way as emblems of spectacular suffering. So I'm curious if you could say more about how your work and the curation of your own family archives attempt to push back against this humanitarian refugee aesthetic that really we seem to be locked into time and time again. How do you think family photography can be used in a way that does not attempt to erase the pain and suffering that refugee communities actually live through, while at the same time also serving these communities and their needs for communal regeneration, healing, strengthening relations and kinship?
Thanks for that question, Nizang. I guess some part of this project was inspired by kind of the frustration with just all sorts of assumptions that we already know without having to look at different kinds of family photos, what a family looks like and their function. Assumptions that we know what war looks like and how it's experienced, when so much of kind of the narratives of war are, of course, written by kind of those who have the capacity to create official archives. And in the case of Cambodia and Vietnam, it's usually from the perspective of American experiences. And my book was really trying to kind of complicate and nuance what an American experience actually is, and to shift kind of the perspective to take into account Vietnamese experiences of the war, as so much of research in Vietnamese American and Vietnamese studies is actually trying to do as well. And so the meta-narrative of refugees as waves of boats and masses that shift between kind of an overwhelming sense of mass suffering on the one hand, to demonstrate kind of the compelling need for action, and on the other hand, a individualizing focus that draws on a discourse of humanitarianism. They're both flip sides of the same coin, and they don't fully kind of encompass the range of emotions and experiences that refugees address. So my interest is really kind of opening up both the framework for visual representation, as well as attending to kind of the responses within refugee communities, how they rework these materials, work within conventions and push back against those conventions. So it's not to suggest that suffering isn't part of the narrative, but to consider kind of why it is part of the narrative, and what gets done with that narrative, and what other range of emotions is possible. I actually have some questions for you. Are we allowed to go back and forth?
Sure, let's go.
Do you want
to? No, I just wanted
questions?
to like follow up
Okay.
and say, I've also heard you talk about the difference between compulsory witnessing that refugees are often subjected to, and then the way that refugee family photography is also working against the conventions of compulsory witnessing.
Oh yeah. So the dialogue that Yideng is what you're talking about is the kind of the larger dialogue that the Critical Refugee and Migration Studies research group is embarking on in developing a new project. And we really wanted to kind of open up refugee storytelling. And we've just noted that this pattern of compulsory testimony is kind of the framework within that refugees are forced to enter into in order to tell a particular kind of story, in order to even achieve recognition as refugees, as kind of a necessary part of their passage, right? And what we are kind of interested in is how both refugee communities both kind of respond to that compulsory storytelling. It's not like you can opt out, right? Like if you want to be recognized as a refugee, if you want to seek asylum, that's really necessary. But also to consider detours, refusals, and other kinds of responses beyond that. Can I ask you questions? Yeah. So I was struck by how your discussion mobilizes the anecdote as a way of reckoning with the aftermath of war. So can you comment or elaborate on how war, or at least the aftermath of wars in Southeast Asia, have been discursively framed, and comment on the productiveness of the anecdote as a means of grappling with war differently?
Thank you for that question, T. I think it's really at the heart of what I was trying to get at today in sharing the anecdotes that I shared. And as I mentioned, the entire book intersperses different kinds of family anecdotes with more conventional scholarly analysis of literary analysis, cultural analysis, history, and theory. So in particular, the anecdote that I shared about the days before the fall of Phnom Penh at the end of the US bombardments of Cambodia was something that I wanted to share because I am influenced by Saidiya Hartman's discussion of, telling a story that is capable of countering the violence of abstraction, and the importance of doing this when we are telling stories about refugees and about war, and about wars that have been essentially forgotten or rendered into minor anecdotes in the history of the 20th century, like what happened in Cambodia. And so while I wanted to try to tell a story to counter the violence of abstraction, I think it's also important to balance that need with the need to also capture the abstraction necessary to say something about the assemblage of permanent and ongoing war. And so you know, the details about the US bombing of Cambodia, remind us all that this is a history that the US military has never been held accountable for. It's a history that gave rise to the necropolitical conditions that formed the Khmer Rouge regime and that went on to commit a genocide. And, at the end of, the US bombing, only a few refugees were people who were able to have connections with the existing regime in Cambodia. Only a few people were able to be evacuated, and the rest were left behind to kind of fend for themselves against the ravages of the war. And so, when I was telling that story, I wanted to then kind of contextualize it with the scenes that we're seeing unfolding today around the world, and most recently in Afghanistan, and all of the scenes that keep replaying over and over again since the post 9/11 US war on terror, which has implicated over 85 different countries in different kinds of warfare, whether it's low intensity or counterinsurgency or drone strikes. And I'm kind of like interested in the way in which the topic of the lessons of war keeps coming up over and over again. I know like you probably saw that op-ed by Viet Nguyen in the New York Times, where he says, I remember, I haven't forgotten the lessons of Vietnam, and neither have you. And I've just been hearing this a lot lately. Like I had a conversation with the Canadian author Kim Thuy lately, and she also, used the same analogy. I hear this in Cambodia, where people are saying, Cambodia is actually a better precedent for what's happening in Afghanistan now. So let's talk about that. And I see the value of drawing on this discursive framework when we are faced with this kind of repetition. But at the same time, I also wanted to think about how this invokes a kind of racial grammar of, the failed lessons of war logic that's underwritten by what Haley calls a liberal notion of wounding, or what Denise Ferreira da Silva says, a logics of separability and determinacy and sequentiality. And so how can we kind of move beyond this logic of like the failed, that transforms one war into a precedent that is then, described as unprecedented, and then, following this framework of continuous wars that are unprecedented and precedents for the next one. And I wanted to think about how this logic potentially forecloses an understanding of what I said about like thinking about the structure of permanent US war. And so kind of going back to like just the war anecdote, I wanted to say something about how, this family anecdote is a way of insisting that wars, like wars in Cambodia, are not abstractions, that they're lived and embodied histories that we carry in our communities. But at the same time, this anecdote is not to be seen as an exception, that it is also part of a kind of broader entangled structure, an assemblage of permanent war. So Cambodia is not a failed lesson that we failed to learn from when we're faced with Afghanistan today. It's essentially part of the same war.
So several things, I'm just going to go off script here. The several things that struck me in listening to you right now speak so movingly about this. So it reminds me when you turn to kind of the family anecdote of in Black diaspora studies, Christina Sharp's work on, her incredible book on wake work, when she turns to the personal as a resource. And she says that the reason for this, first of all, is pushing back against kind of hierarchies of knowledge within academia that have dismissed the personal as self-indulgent me search. This is serious business, but it's also to push back against abstraction, to consider kind of the way in which history is weighs down on the body and is experienced in these very highly personal ways. And so we really see resonances between this work. And I've been grappling with the analogy and the limitations of the analogy, which is what you so movingly just spoke to right now. Because what I'm gathering you're saying that is we have to be better historians, right? So to suggest kind of that there's an analogy and therefore some kind of break, right? Like this happened and now this is happening, and it only happens because we've forgotten, is it's just poor reading of both kind of the resources that we have, but kind of a poor understanding of how those how those meta narratives get framed and who they actually serve. It's to obscure, it's to suggest that there is some kind of rupture that needs to be repaired when actually there's a continuity at play here. So in line with this, I wanted to ask, you've spoken so compellingly about the knowledges and insights that can be accessed through anecdotes. What remains elusive? And to, what you also kind of talked about some anecdotes being just, serving the needs of a particular kind of community, not for everyone to access or to share.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say, since you bring up Christina Sharp too, and in the wake, and of course, like she also references Hartman in the discussion of the need to tell a personal story to counter abstraction. But when you were talking about your family photos as well, you talked about the redaction of the birthdays, the way in which like somebody had erased like specific details, and that I found so fascinating because it suggests the way in which refugees themselves kind of navigate the violence of state bureaucracy and the humanitarian regime in order to to push back against that discipline. And the question I wanted to ask you about that, it just related to how is that form of erasure and redaction and rewriting of family photography a form of creativity and a form of refusal, as you've seen it in your own work. But yeah, to answer your question just about the anecdote, and also what should remain kind of unspoken and what remains elusive. I think I was trying to get at that with the first anecdote about the ground and just naming and the story of my mother's labor in going towards the refugee camp, trying to transform something that was so traumatic and so difficult into a new future, and that aspiration that she carried. And I saw that as a parallel just in some ways to that kind of perilous ground of just navigating that tension of trying to write your family stories and trying to tell those personal anecdotes in a way that respects the bonds and the intimacy and the ethics of working within your family and within the community. And I was really inspired by the Cambodian American poet Monica Sok, who is also referencing Audre Lorde, and the essay on the transformation of silence into action and language. And I think it's like what Lorde says and what Sok says as well. It's like part of it is just like what serves me as a writer in some cases, because I've carried these family stories for my whole life, long before I ever became an academic. My parents were storytellers, and they love to talk about the past and about everything they went through. And it's only when I later became an academic that it was all of these stories that I held inside of me. Suddenly I started to gain a slightly different context for them, which was not my refugee familial community context, but my scholarly and academic one. And so there's almost this process of having to then kind of reverse and look backwards into everything I know, and try and piece together certain stories that I needed to work with in order to provide me the theoretical framing, provide understanding that I just couldn't find in the existing scholarship. And so it's like what I think of as a really treacherous and difficult ethical ground to navigate, which requires going much further beyond a typical just research ethics board's approval and permissions and disclosure and final cut. And those things are all kind of a given, but it's also about collaboration and like co-creation of these stories, and also respecting the boundaries of what someone wants to say and what they don't want to say, understanding what they want to emphasize in the story, and also staying and respecting the intimacy and privileging that over any other kinds of academic or professional imperatives.